Okay, hi everyone. This is Robin from AuTeach, and here today we have April Boyce, Miss April on TikTok, and Go Beyond Inclusion on Instagram. So I will let April introduce herself, and then I will disappear for a little while. She's going to talk to us about equity and racial justice. And PBIS, right? Sort of.
mostly restorative justice.
Yeah.
Today.
Or an alternative. Let's put it that way. So, April, go ahead and introduce yourself. We're so happy you're here.
Yeah, sure. So my name's April, also known as Miss April on TikTok. I have over 10 years of experience in education, and I started as a preschool teacher, and I taught Head Start for a couple of years before moving into research and research on childcare quality and improvement. I've been an elementary accessibility specialist for the last 3 years. So I've worked in an inclusion program for students with varying disabilities, but mostly with autism and ADHD and other developmental delays. But this fall, I'll actually be starting my work on my PhD for the University of Washington, and I'll be doing research for the university's Center for Inclusive Education. And recently I started a website called Beyond Inclusion. It's a professional learning community, and my goal is to engage anti-racist and anti-ableist educators through interactive learning opportunities. And the hope is that we're enabling educators with the skills to liberate every child. So the space is designed for educators to build connection with each other, engage in the process of inquiry, and really just empower one another to reflect and transform our own practice and our schools.
Amazing. I'm so happy that you're doing this work, and it's so desperately needed. I don't see you on the camera right now, so I don't know if
okay. Oh, there. It turned off for some reason.
No worries. So I'm going to mute myself and pull myself out of the stream, so it'll just be you, and when you're done, I'll come back, and then we can do Q&A. Everyone, while you are watching, leave your questions in the comments, and we will get to them at the end. So April, you can take it away.
Okay, sounds good. Great. So can you see my slides? Hopefully you can. All right, so today we will be talking about promoting equity in schools through restorative practice. So our first objective will be to learn the background of restorative justice and the need for restorative practice in education. Our second objective will be to learn how restorative practice is used in schools and how it benefits school communities. And then lastly, we'll gain an understanding of how to shift to a restorative mindset and practices. So what is restorative practice? Well, it comes from restorative justice, and in modern context, restorative justice practice was introduced by the criminal justice system in the 1970s, but it is important to know that it actually originated from many First Nation populations in Africa, North America, and New Zealand, where it was the main justice structure in those communities prior to the arrival of colonists. So restorative justice is a method of approaching wrongdoing that focuses on repairing the harm done to people and relationships rather than only punishing the offenders. So the criminal justice system looks at what laws have been broken, who did it, and what do they deserve. But restorative justice asks 3 different questions, and it's who's been hurt, what are their needs, and whose obligations are these? So in education, this work is referred to as restorative practice, and it can be used to promote equity and inclusion in schools. So why do we need to have restorative practice in schools, and what does equity have to do with it? Well, one of the biggest inequities in education is it has to do with discipline, and it's something called the school-to-prison pipeline. And the school-to-prison pipeline is what some might call like a phenomenon or a trend, but others might consider it more of a very intentional socio-political strategy where children in the K-12 system and even as young as preschool are funneled out of the public school system and into the criminal justice system. And this is an issue because many of these children are Black and brown, and many of them have disabilities or are labeled as having disabilities. And I say labeled as having disabilities because a lot are given the EBD label, emotional behavior disturbance, even though there might be some other underlying factors at play, like being Black in America, basically. So many of these students would really benefit from interventions, additional education, or counseling services, or like even just treated like human beings and given opportunities for restorative justice. But instead of that, they are punished, they're restrained, they're suspended, they're segregated, they're isolated, and then they're eventually pushed out of the school system. So Black students and disabled students are disproportionately disciplined compared to their white non-disabled peers. And some data from the US Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, found that Black males represent 8% of enrolled students, but 25% of those have received an out-of-school suspension. And students with disabilities represent 12% of the nation's students, but 26% have received an out-of-school suspension. So when schools don't use restorative practices, there's likely poor student and staff relationships, which students then feel a lack of connection to the community, and that then increases behavioral challenges. They're sent to the office and suspended, and because they're not in class, they're missing a lot of academic content, which leads to poor academic performance. And then they might repeat a grade or drop out of school altogether, and then they're further pushed into the juvenile justice system. And so that's kind of that pipeline that we were talking about. Schools that do implement restorative practices have, however, found a reduction in student aggression, less disciplinary referrals, and less suspensions. But they've seen an increase in the quality of student-teacher relationships, student social skills, and overall school climate. Now, restorative practice in education, it's proactive, and it's a preventative approach that teaches social emotional skills and examines the root cause of negative behaviors. So it's a positive way of thinking about and talking about and responding to issues and problems that arise in schools. I'd say it's not so much of like a program, but it's more of a way of life. And we really have to embody and believe in the restorative philosophy. And as with everything, it's best as a school-wide approach. So the goal for schools is to build restorative culture by using proactive measures and also, responsive interventions as they arise. So the first tier that you see on the triangle is preventative. So that's where we're building relationships. We make sure that we have routines and traditions in place so that students feel, like they know the routine, and they know what's going on and know what to expect. We want to see social emotional lessons done daily and embedded into like the academic instruction. And teachers should be trained in culturally responsive pedagogies. Instruction needs to be engaging so children want to actually pay attention and listen. And then the next tier is maintaining relationships. So we want to make sure that we're managing challenges with restorative conversations and classroom problem-solving circles for support. And then that last tier is resolving conflicts and repairing relationships with conferencing circles of support and accountability. All right, one second. So the benefits of restorative practice in schools is many. So one is that it fosters deeper learning and relationships within classrooms and school communities. It creates a trusting environment where students can learn and they want to participate. They feel comfortable taking risks because they feel supported. And it also helps repair community after harm is done. And it does this through collaborative problem solving. And then it's also inclusive, and it offers the students the opportunity to reintegrate into a positive learning community. So restorative practice and SEL go hand in hand. It's all about taking advantage of teachable moments to learn social emotional skills, which are also really just life lessons. Having strong social emotional skills can lead to positive future outcomes whatever you see success as being for a student or the student sees for themselves. So it could be, positive outcomes in school or college or job success. It's SEL is great for all of those things. With restorative practice, students learn to become aware of the impacts of their actions and behaviors. And so there's an emphasis on self-awareness and social awareness, but there's a lot more that they can get out of it. So students also learn communication skills and listening skills. They learn self-management and understand how to manage their emotions. They learn how to advocate for their needs, and they learn relationship skills and responsible decision-making skills. A lot of students, they're not explicitly taught these skills, and typically it's only given to students with IEPs, but when we implement school-wide restorative practices, they're given structured and safe environments to practice these skills, and then they finally feel like they have a voice, and they know that it's okay to make mistakes because they get a chance to repair them after the harm has been done. So restorative principles are they're life skills. They're focused on conflict resolution, peace education, communication, and healing. It's a very humanizing approach toward education, right? So we're more likely to do more for our students and support their needs when we see them as humans rather than just kids that we're trying to push through the system. When our students feel safe and seen and heard, they're able to focus on their learning, which of course will lead to better academic outcomes. So you might have heard the quote, if you're a teacher, Maslow before Bloom. And if not, this is the idea that educators should meet students' basic needs for safety and belonging before turning to more challenging academic tasks. So the triangle at the bottom is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Above that is Bloom's taxonomy, which is basically just another hierarchy triangle for the process of learning. So we must Maslow before we Bloom. As humans, our brains function for the purpose of lots of things, but the most primitive involve avoiding threats, seeking safety through community, and maximizing positive experiences. And all humans have a deep desire to connect with others and be in good, positive relationships. So when we're talking about equitable schools, it means this picture right here. It means that we're providing the appropriate supports that a student might need to get to that bloom, that top of that triangle, even if we're not doing it for all the other students. So equity might look like a modification on an assignment. It could be an accommodation like a ramp or assistive technology. Or equity could also come in the form of simply spending more time with one student to try to connect with them. So you might sacrifice one of your lunches with your colleagues just to sit with a student that's hard to reach. Or maybe it's just taking a few minutes out of your day to say hi to them in the hallway. All right, it looks different for every child because every student has different needs, and some might just have more needs than others, and that's okay. Fairness does not always mean equal. Fairness means that everyone gets what they need to be successful. So we need to shift to a restorative mindset. And although we set expectations and we have good intentions in teaching children right from wrong, traditionally, the response to expectations not being met is often in the form of warnings, threats, exclusion, public shaming, and loss of privileges. So a lot of traditional discipline systems are based in punishments or rewards, and mistakes are seen as the opportunity to teach a child a lesson, but they're not actually thought of as the opportunity to teach a student how to do something. So what it really means is just to punish the child. But punishments are based in fear and compliance. They can stop a behavior in the moment, but they don't actually do anything to teach students effective skills to get their needs met in a more appropriate way. So when we use punitive measures, we often start labeling kids as the good kids and the bad kids, and that is very harmful. It leads to a lot of negative outcomes in both the short and the long term. especially to BIPOC and disabled students, right? And that's that disproportionality of discipline that we discussed. So what we want to do is move into more of a restorative mindset and discipline practices, which is actually teaching more socially appropriate behaviors. It's more effective and more sustainable because it offers kids the opportunity to learn skills and change behavior, and it also helps their brain make more connections to make better choices in the future. So how do we go about having a restorative mindset? Well, there's 3 exercises that you can do to foster a restorative mindset. The first one is spend time building positive relationships. Relationships are key to restorative work. So we need to know our students and we need to figure out what makes them tick. It creates a mutual trust and respect, and they're more likely to cooperate with you when you need them to the most. The next thing is examine your current mindset regarding punishment and consequences. So how you view punishment and consequences will motivate your actions toward how you treat students when they've done something wrong. So instead of focusing on blame and punishment, we want to focus on the harm that's been caused to students. We want to focus on steps that we need to take to move forward toward healing, and we need to find ways that we can help the offender take an active role in repairing the harm. Also, as adults, we need to stop making all the decisions, but instead involve students in the process. So we got to treat it like a collaborative effort where multiple perspectives and opinions are weighed equally. So reflection is really important for this one. It might even be helpful to think about discipline procedures that you've experienced or witnessed in your own schooling experience or in your own household as a child, and how you think that might have impacted your current mindset. And then the last one is reframe individual students and their behavior. So quite often, students with challenging behavior get stigmatized, which can follow them throughout their whole educational career. These labels can influence how we treat students, especially if we're really frustrated by them and their behaviors. So instead of seeing behavior as personal, we have to think about what is it that the child is trying to tell us or communicate, because behavior is communication. So what do they want to obtain? What do they want to escape from? It could be they want to attain someone's attention, or maybe they want to escape from an undesired task. There's lots of different functions of behavior. Reframing students and their behaviors can go a long way in helping us work more restoratively with them. So one exercise you could do is think about a student that you find difficult to work with. Write down a few words that come to mind when you think of that student, and then think about, is it a negative word? Is it a positive word? Is it stigmatizing? So for every negative word or statement, we want to write a positive one. So we're flipping that script in our brain. So instead of a student being attention seeking, they might be connection seeking. Instead of a child being manipulative, they're strategic. So we want to do this and think deeply about individual student strengths and take note of when they display those things, and then celebrate it with them as you try to build connection. So yes, we have to understand that everyone is innately good and capable of change. Social and emotional capabilities need to be taught and reinforced, even to kids without disabilities, right? So we often think of social skills only for students with disabilities, but it's for everybody. Oftentimes we want immediate results, but we also have to remember that it's really important to do this work, and the relational approach just takes a lot of time. We just have to stay consistent with it. Okay, so more things to think about when switching to a more restorative mindset is going from punitive discipline to restorative discipline. So we're moving from fear to respect. So moving from teachers commanding respect through warnings and threats to teachers gaining respect by modeling it for their students, because respect is a two-way street, even when we're talking about adults and child relationships. We want to move from rules to engagement. So it shouldn't all be about compliance and enforcing rules. It should be more about the class being engaging so students want to work and participate. They should play an active role in creating the classroom culture. We're moving from control to support. So instead of teachers telling students what they're doing wrong, we want students to be part of the process. We want them reflecting on their behavior, and we want to give them opportunities to make changes and improve. Definitely move away from public shaming and move into private conversations. We don't want to yell at students. It doesn't help. Students, we got to call them in and tell them what they're doing right or what they should be doing. And then move from anger to understanding. So again, stop yelling at kids, use a gentle tone, and punishment to reflection. So with punishment, good behavior is really just based on the fear of getting in trouble. But when we move to like the restorative mindset, students then know that they can make good choices because they want to do it for their community and the well-being of everybody. So to sum it up, restorative practice is the belief that people will make changes when those in positions of authority do things with them rather than to them or for them. So the vertical axis on this image is related to the structure of the classroom. How does the teacher discipline and set limits? And then the horizontal axis is how encouraging or nurturing a teacher is. So we're striving to be like in that restorative quadrant, which is also known as the authoritative way to teach, or what Zaretta Hammond calls a warm demander. Okay, so moving into restorative discipline tips and techniques. So one of my favorite things to do when I get a new student is the 2x10 intervention. And this one is for like students that you might have a really hard time connecting with, the ones that like don't want to speak to you or have anything to do with you. It's just 2 minutes per day of one-on-one interaction over 10 consecutive days. So this is really focused on connection and learning about the student and their interests. You are not to talk about school. You're just trying to figure out what makes that student tick. For a lot of students that really have a hard time connecting with adults, they might not talk to you. So you might just be talking to them, but it's important for you to also share about yourself so that they can kind of feel like you're not just like a robot teacher, but a human. So that's a really good strategy to try. Restorative conversations are very helpful. The purpose of them is to hold the offenders accountable by helping them understand and acknowledge that they caused harm, and they understand other people's perspective of the harm that they caused. And we want them to recognize that they had a choice in what they did, and they need to figure out how they can fix the situation, make amends, and then do better next time. So this is a form that I often use with my older students. And of course, you don't have to use this form every single time you work with a student. It can be a verbal conversation. But for me and the students that I worked with, they often would re-escalate for these conversations because this is reflection work. Like, it's not fun. Like, think about the last time that you had to say sorry to somebody. Like, it's not comfortable. So it was really hard for them to do these, but we got through them. The sheets were a guide to help me keep the conversation focused, and visuals actually help a lot of students, and it helps their brain make connections. So I recommend this kind of flow chart. Do not just hand a student a worksheet and be like, here you go, do this during recess. Like, that's not what we should do. It's not the purpose. It's not a compliance task. We want to actively work with the offender to help them work through the process. And this is also like a relationship building activity, because students, you're building trust with the student, and they know that you're not just going to give up on them. So with these restorative conversations, the first thing you want to do is thank a student for having the meeting, because again, it's not a fun thing to do. We should then listen to the student's perspective. So in this case, the student ripped up all the work in the hallways. We want to identify the root causes. So that student was feeling mad. And the reason they were feeling mad is they didn't like the way that their drawing turned out. So oftentimes feelings of anger actually stem from like a lot of other things, like in this case, disappointment. We then want to identify the impact. So it upset his classmates, and he didn't get a chance to finish his drawing. And he had to miss out on part of his recess to tape up the work. So those are the consequences. And I want you to notice that those are consequences, but they're not punishments. So consequences don't have to mean punishment. Consequences are just what happens after a behavior happens. And that's like a whole nother topic. Okay, and then you also want to make a plan for improvement with that student. So next time the student feels mad, he'll ask his teacher for a break. He'll walk away from the situation, take some deep breaths, and then ask a teacher for another piece of paper. So now the student has skills that they can take and use next time that something like this happens again. This is just an example of a sheet that I might use with a younger student. So similar questions, just a different format with less words and more visuals. Okay, so when we're having these conversations, we want to make sure that we're using restorative language. So instead of judgment, we need to listen to have, instead of judgment, we need to move to empathetic listening. So instead of saying, what did you do now? Or why would you do such a thing? Or he should be punished. We say, I see that you're upset about what happened. I'm feeling a little frustrated myself, but I want to hear your side of things. So tell me about what happened. Instead of demanding respect, we should use I statements. So instead of saying, you better stop this, or don't you dare speak to me like that, or thinking like he's so disrespectful, we can use I statements. So when you raised your voice and threw your pencil, I felt surprised and upset because in this class, we value trust and safety. So an I message can help you communicate your concerns and feelings and needs without sounding threatening or sound like you're blaming others for what they've done to you. It helps get your point across without causing the listener to shut down. And so this can be used for adults too, adult to adult conversations. So the I statements say, this is how things look from my side. I feel upset versus you didn't listen to me and you made me feel upset is totally different, right? It makes the listener, they don't feel as defensive. So it ultimately just creates more opportunities to resolve conflict because it keeps doors open for more constructive dialogue. And at the same time, it's also a really great opportunity to embed lessons of perspective taking, which again is a skill that we teach a lot to disabled students, but it's really a skill that everyone needs to be explicitly taught. We should also shift from diagnosing the situation. So instead of saying like, if you would just listen, or that was malicious, you are the problem, or OMG, what is wrong with this kid, right? Instead of thinking that, we should shift to more restorative questions. What happened? Tell me about what you're feeling. What do you think you need to do to make this situation right? And how can I help you? So to wrap things up, just remember that we don't ever blame the flower. If we plant a flower and we notice that it's starting to wilt, we don't blame the flower. Instead, we look at why it's not doing well and we figure out what's causing the flower to wilt, right? So we look for ways to improve the conditions for that flower. We might give it water. We might give it more sun and put it in a different window. Maybe we add some fertilizer, right? But we always give it a second chance. So the wilting of that flower is the flower communicating that it needs more. And we can look at this analogy, we can look at students the same way. So if a student is showing challenging behavior, having a restorative mindset would allow us to take a deeper look at the situation and give the appropriate equitable supports and then give that child another opportunity to thrive. So that is all I have for today. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Well, we will have a Q&A after this, but this is how you can find me.
Okay. Hi. Thank you so much, April. That
Yeah.
was amazing. Like how much practical information, like that you fit into, you gave us all the theory and then stuff to do on top of it. I think this is going to be like a hugely important thing for people to hear for the I'll Teach audience. We have some comments on the side, but before we get to those, a lot of the people watching are probably parents. And so maybe we could talk like a little bit about like if parents are not sure, right? If their child's schools are doing restorative practices, or if they're not, like what would be some signs that like it's happening or not, and then how might they bring this information to their school administrators?
I think that it's kind of obvious, especially if their child maybe has, challenging behaviors because they're getting phone calls all the time or just getting negative emails. That's kind of the telltale sign. Whereas a more restorative school probably does more positive phone calls or emails home. So like preventative stuff, like building that relationship with the families. And yeah, I think kids just feel better at restorative schools,
Yeah.
right? Like they're treated like humans instead of children. And that's the thing, like I constantly think about before I do something with or to a child, I think about like, if I was an adult, like would I like if somebody told me that I couldn't go to the bathroom, because they were still talking? Like, no, right? So that's something that we need to reframe as educators is, as an adult, do we want to be treated like this?
Yeah, I mean, I could say so many things about this. But yeah, I mean, you've been in lots of classrooms. I've been in lots of classrooms, and the amount of classrooms I see where the overarching kind of culture is one of, how do I want to put this? Control, right? And very much about the, all of these like shiny techniques of control. So now we have desk pets and clip charts and all this kind of stuff, right? But ultimately, it's about a kind of I'm doing to you as opposed to how you framed it, which was so helpful. I'm doing with you, which is a totally different thing. So we have some questions. Some comments. Somebody said, yes, control is the norm. So Hannah said, I like to ask my students what steps they feel they need to take to reestablish trust in the learning community after they have had a big escalation. Thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a big one. It's part of the restorative conversations is letting them just be part of like, what are your consequences? So, there's the consequences of like after the behavior. I made people mad. I missed out on a preferred activity, but then also thinking of the consequence of like, what kind of repair do we have to do? So when they're part of that conversation and making the choice of what their consequences, that they're more likely to do it, right? So instead of being like, you're going to miss recess, like they think of, I'm going to put up the papers back on the wall and I'll do it during recess because I don't want to miss out on another thing or something like that. Yeah. I guess it wasn't really a question, but
more of a comment, really.
Yeah.
But you're going into academia, so you should get used to questions that aren't questions. I totally agree with this. How do you get all teachers on board, especially when our school is so PBIS? This is a great question.
It is a great question. It's hard to get all teachers on board. Like, this is a whole paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Like, it took me 3 years to figure out this philosophy. And I think it's just about educating other people, continuing to advocate, standing up when you're hearing harm at staff meetings. It's tricky. But I will say that I guess you kind of have to build your social capital at the school. And that's a whole nother problem. Like, who has the higher say at schools, right? It's often, the white veteran teachers. But what we need to do is shift who is kind of at the top and who has that social capital, and making sure it's a person that believes in restorative practice. So if you can get an in to talk to that person, if you can get admin to start really believing in this philosophy, then that's kind of how it can maybe trickle down to other parts of the school.
I've also seen at work, where you may be able to not get the whole school on board, but maybe you can get a grade level team on board, right? And in your professional learning communities or however your school does it, if you do grade level PLCs or if you do, special ed, whatever, but you can kind of sometimes get a group on board and then almost use the data or whatever,
Yeah.
Exactly. Translate it into the stuff that they care about, to be well, in my class, we have this many less incidents or whatever, even though that's not how we should be thinking about it. But I feel sometimes you have to kind of translate it to their language so that they understand that it's even by other metrics, which are not the metrics we would consider success, even by traditional metrics of classroom management, right? It still is a better approach.
Right. Yeah. Everyone always wants to see the data and see success in
we can talk about that forever. Also, hold on, let me get this out of here. Also, bring Beyond Inclusion and a PD for a PD, I'm guessing. Are you, I'm working onto your school, so it's not coming from you. Oh, yeah. So to bring you, April, Beyond Inclusion, to do a PD for them.
Yeah, sure. Why not? I'd be happy to.
Yeah, no, sometimes you can do that. And sometimes it can even come from the parents, which that works really well because then it's not that kind of power struggle of teacher versus teacher, right? It's, someone in the community is asking for this, or it's in this IEP, or for the parents that are watching that have IEPs, you can even include that as part of an IEP, that you are going to use restorative practices as part of the behavior plan. Okay. It's so hard. April, do you have resources to present on restorative justice to staff in a staff meeting?
Just my slides I have. Yeah, I've got those. Yeah, there's one of the books I recently read was something about carrots and sticks. It's by Dominique Smith, but it's a really easy read for educators that kind of gives a just overview, a really simple overview of what restorative practices look like in schools. So that might be a good one to show to staff.
I also recommend a lot Alfie Kohn's work. People really like that. Punished by Rewards, which is a great book. It's old, but people still like it. And then also Mona Delahooke's Beyond Behaviors. Have you ever read that?
It sounds familiar.
That's a little bit more, I can, hold on, I'll type it. Mona Delahooke, who she's around, she does a lot of stuff. She has a book. She's a floor time person, but she's specifically coming from the floor time stuff. She's a lot of disability specific stuff about behaviors, but it's very restorative plus kind of the more like play-centric disability autism stuff. So super helpful, especially for parents of autistic kids. So I want to kind of pivot like actually to the beginning of your presentation to talk about, you brought up a lot of things about disproportionality in terms of discipline and then also in terms of identification within special education. And I thought maybe we could talk a little bit for the people watching that, especially because, you know, it's an interesting line that we toe where we're telling parents to, you know, get their kids identified and get services, but then also there's this tension because there's such over identification of Black and brown children, right? So it's like kind of a tension between what is real, what is helping my child, like maybe we could talk a little bit about that for the parents that are watching, if you're down with that.
Sure, I'll try.
So when you are, as a teacher, when you are referring children for evaluation, what's your kind of thought process and how do you kind of unpack some of maybe, you know, the disproportionality stuff as you're doing that? Like what should parents be aware
of? So as an educator in special education, what I would do is make sure that I collected a variety of data from parents and their teachers and anyone else that interacts with them, just so we're getting that whole child, like the picture of the whole child. And so if you're a parent, making sure that you're being asked for your input on what the child is like at home, like what are your concerns, what are your hopes for the child, what do you see as their biggest challenges at school and at home, like those kind of things. And that's kind of how I approach like just getting that process started, and starting to think about what goals we might need to work on.
Yeah. So. Also, just for people listening, also making sure that they are evaluating in all areas of suspected disability. So when it's behavior, that we're actually doing thorough educational evaluations and catching all of the, you know, if there's learning stuff, often, you know, we're quick to, especially with non-white students, like we're quick in schools, right, to overuse the emotional and behavioral disability label as opposed to digging deeper. And behavior comes from somewhere. And in my experience, most of the time that I'm working on, you know, a case that is supposedly, you know, behavior, it's always academic. There's always something that people missed, right? Mm-hmm. So I go observe and I'm like, well, they can't read, so that's a problem. And, you know, it appears on paper, right, that it's like, you know, just behavior, but it's not, right? There's always something else. So for parents that are watching, making sure that the school is evaluating in all areas of suspected disability, which actually is the law, what they have to do. Mm-hmm. Let's see, somebody said, I was never on board with PBIS. April, you've been really like critical of PBIS on TikTok, and I've been like appreciative of it so much because I feel like so many teachers are like, you know, that's what they are, especially young teachers, right, in teacher school. That's what they want to teach them. That's like the only thing that we teach them. How do you see the relationship between PBIS and restorative justice? Or would you say they're opposites, or?
I think there's like, so I don't know all the nuances of PBIS, but it's, what I do know is that it's not used correctly. If, you know, there's people that are really all about PBIS, and so I don't know, I don't know what those people know, but how it's being used in schools is mostly with like rewards and punishments, or not punishments, but rewards. And that extrinsic motivation, I've learned this year, like that's been a whole shift for me in my thinking of how I work with students. It's it's harmful to kids, right? So we are rewarding them for behaving in the way that we want them to behave. And I think about my students, my autistic students, and like I've been rewarding them for sitting down in the classroom and being quiet, and just masking their like true brilliance. And it's, why are we rewarding that? Like there's so much more to them. I don't know. I haven't been able to really fully articulate my frustration about it, but
I will tell you that I've seen in classrooms, like I used to be a kindergarten teacher, and I was in kindergarten, self-contained, right? So a lot of my kids were coming from like kind of intense ABA preschool. And so you would meet them, right? And you'd be like, hi, what's your name? And they'd be like, Matthew, and like stick out their hand for like an M&M. Like, like they were like expecting it. They're like, all right, if I'm going to say it though, like usually I only do that for like candy. So pay up. Like, we're not going to do that here. Yeah. Like, I'm just trying to be your friend. Like, but it really does happen. Like they're so conditioned to expect, like, it's like, what are you going to do for me then? Well, how many? And it gets tricky, right? Because I have older kids now whose parents are like, listen, every time they do something, they want an Xbox game. Like I can't, they're not satisfied with stickers anymore. Like they want, Robux every time that they blink. And like, they age out of it. Like even if it is effective, which that's debatable, it's not really sustainable.
Exactly. Yeah. And then they grow up to be adults that just want more and more and more and more. Like
there was a really interesting TikTok that somebody was talking about how as an adult, like having been through special education, they had a hard time actually doing things. They didn't even know like what they enjoyed, or like they didn't want to write, in their journal or anything that like other people wouldn't see, because they'd been so conditioned to do, I do this, I get this, or I do this, I get praised. I do this, that they had actually not developed like a very strong sense of intrinsic motivation.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the problem, is that when we're rewarding kids, we're not teaching them the like true value of rules. Right? Like we don't run in the hallway because we want to make sure that people don't get hurt. Right. We raise our hand in class because we want to make sure that everyone's voices are heard, and everyone gets a turn to talk. Like we don't get to the real reason that we have rules, because kids often just think that they have to follow rules because that's what the adult says.
Right. There's not actually tying it to that intrinsic motivator of, care for others or safety or, a real reason that resonates on a deeper level, which is why we even have rules.
Right. And I think that's where it ties in with the restorative practices, because with restorative practice, you're teaching students that we do things because we care about our own personal safety and well-being, and also the safety of our community. So, yeah.
Lovely. Last question. I'm going to take this one off. Somebody said, so true, in English language, learners are often overplaced in special education. Absolutely. We have a hard time teasing out language issues. And there's actually the first talk from the series, Maria Trepena talked about that quite a bit. That's actually her thing. And I have so much to say about PBIS. So much of the foundational principles are great and consistent with what we spoke about, but the problem is the implementation. I could agree with that.
Yeah, I think teachers really want quick and fast ways to manage their classrooms, but restorative practice takes work, and it's hard, and it takes time for students to build relationships, and they have to learn by doing things over and over and over again. So there was like one comment I got, it was about my behavior maps, and it said, what if they don't do it after the third time? And I said, well, you do it 3 more times until they actually start to, it actually starts to click. That's just how it works.
Yeah, like it's, but we're so used to thinking in that mindset of like, well, how do I make them? I want to make them, tell me how. And that just speaks to like how entrenched, right, that like teacher, a good teacher is a teacher who has control of her class, or that's very much, in even the way we're evaluated as teachers. Last question. This is actually a question I have, because I know a lot of the people who are listening, their kids are not super verbal. And, I can imagine, because this is a common thing that I get as I give advice, and then people say, well, what if they're nonverbal? So maybe we could talk a little bit about maybe what restorative practices could look like for students who are not, maybe don't have as much language to kind of process. Any thoughts or advice for people who want to implement something like this in their classroom or with their children, but maybe don't have, such a high level of language processing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I've always just used a lot of visuals with students with that are not verbal, or English language learners. Pictures are always great. So I always have different of the behavior consequence map sheets that I showed. There's just a whole bunch of different ones that I have. Some don't have any words. They're just pictures where kids can just point to, the different emotions and different actions and behaviors. So that's kind of how I've worked with students with communication needs like that.
Yeah, I've seen it done like really well with people who do like, symbols on a clipboard and they Velcro them, or they give them like a menu. But it definitely can be done. Just want to kind of make that point for everybody.
Yeah. And honestly, like in those moments where you're trying to reflect with students, sometimes less words are better. So visuals are always great.
Yeah, they're great for everybody. Universal design, right? Mm-hmm. Anyway, so I'm going to thank you so much, April, for being here. I'm going to end our stream. And thank you for being here. Anything last minute you want to say? You can follow April at miss.ms.april, right?
Mm-hmm. Underscore TikTok.
And TikTok. And then I'm blanking on your new thing. What is it called?
At Go Beyond Inclusion on Instagram. You can visit my website, gobeyondinclusion.org. We are starting up just this new community. So if you're an educator and just feel like you're alone in your school or your district and you want to have a community of professionals that you can talk to all year round, we're going to have virtual hangouts every month that will, we'll have different breakout rooms of like game nights if you want more casual connection, or problems of practice, things like that. And then I plan to also have Q&A discussion panels with different TikTok and Instagram creators on social justice in schools. So
amazing. Such
great to have you.
I will be joining myself. That sounds amazing. All right. Well, I'm going to end it here. April, hang out for a second, and then I will end it on TikTok too. I'm going to end everybody at one time. Okay.
All right. I'll stay.